They say that luck is when preparation meets opportunity, but Alexander the Great didn't have time to wait for luck. He ran it over. While many kings built empires through diplomacy and time, Alexander decided to conquer the world, starting by crossing a river uphill against one of the greatest armies in history. Sounds crazy? That's because it was. What almost no one tells you is that this first battle wasn't just a military victory, it was a hands-on lesson in boldness, strategy, and leadership. And all of that before he turned 25. But what drives someone to ignore seasoned generals, defy the logic of warfare, and risk their life at the very start of a campaign? What you're about to discover is more than just a historical account. It's the birth of a legend that changed the fate of entire empires, and that carries real lessons for anyone brave enough to step off the sidelines and into the river. Stick with me until the end, because after Granicus, no one in the Persian Empire ever slept peacefully again. Shortly after the death of Philip II, the young Alexander ascended the throne with the fire of ambition in his eyes and the weight of a legacy on his shoulders. But he wasn't the type to back down from a challenge. On the contrary, he seemed to feed off them. With roughly 35,000 soldiers by his side, he crossed the sea and landed in Asia Minor, ready to strike terror into the heart of the Persian Empire. It was more than a military campaign. It was the continuation of a dream interrupted. And when Alexander the Great dreamed, the world had to wake up. The setting was tense, like the silence before a storm. On one side, a young king with a hunger for glory and Macedonian discipline. On the other, the eastern colossus of the Persian Empire, with its wealth, tradition, and endless territories. But Alexander didn't just want to win. He wanted to leave a mark, something that would echo through the centuries. It was as if every step he took was a page in a book yet to be written, but destined to be read out loud. The plan wasn't just to fulfill his father's wish. It was to surpass it. Alexander wanted something bigger, bolder, more eternal. He was there to make history in a way no one would ever forget, like a comet streaking across the sky. And anyone who doubted that young man's capabilities would soon realize that underestimating him was a fatal mistake. Because when he arrived on Persian soil, he didn't ask for permission. He arrived as if he already knew the world was his, and don't think that the soldiers following him were merely obedient followers. No way. They believed in Alexander with almost blind faith. It was as if they saw in him something more than a man, a symbol of change, a walking revolution. And the most impressive part is that Alexander lived up to their trust, turning wild ideas into concrete victories. The attack at Granicus wasn't just a military maneuver, it was a declaration of intent, a direct message to the Persian Empire. I'm here, and I came to conquer. The battle hadn't even started yet, but Alexander the Great's spirit was already igniting the hearts of his men. It was the first step on a journey that would later involve twists, broken alliances, and epic confrontations. On the other side of the board, the Persian Empire wasn't sleeping at the wheel. As soon as they learned of Alexander's arrival, the satraps, a sort of regional governors, moved quickly. They gathered an army with heavy cavalry ready to pounce and crush the threat before it gained any traction. They knew that this first battle could decide everything, and no one wanted to be remembered as the satrap who failed Darius III. It was a classic move of imperial defense, fast, hard, with no room for hesitation, and strategically speaking, it made sense. Stopping Alexander right at the start was the best way to snuff out the flame before it turned into a wildfire, but what they didn't count on was the Macedonians' audacity. This guy didn't read the manual. And when you're up against someone who plays by your own rules, standard planning just doesn't cut it. The Persian troops had numbers, familiar territory, and cavalry as their trump card. They were ready to crush any fool who dared to cross the Granicus River. But Alexander wasn't just anyone, and the Persians, even though well-positioned, were about to learn that the hard way. They expected a traditional battle, but they were about to experience a strategic earthquake. The satraps were still stuck in the mindset that Alexander was just a boy playing at being king, a common mistake when arrogance comes into play. The truth is, no matter how organized and confident they were, the Persians were dealing with something out of the ordinary. Alexander the Great wasn't in it to settle for a draw, and the Persian Empire, used to crushing rebels, now faced a conqueror who smiled in the face of danger. Their position seemed solid. High banks, cavalry armed to the teeth, morale soaring. But Alexander wasn't intimidated by landscapes or numbers. The river that separated the two armies wasn't a barrier to him. It was an invitation, a dangerous invitation, of course. But if there was one thing Alexander never did, it was turn down this kind of invitation. Imagine the scene: an icy river, a strong current, an inclined terrain, and an enemy army perched high up, just waiting for a chance to turn you into a colander. It was precisely in that setting that Alexander decided to cross. Yes, out of nowhere, defying his own generals, who, by the way, begged him to wait. But when you're Alexander the Great, waiting seems like a word that doesn't even exist in the dictionary. The man was an avalanche in human form. The generals, battle-hardened veterans, knew it was madness. "But your Majesty going uphill against the current? Attacking up the hill?" Alexander listened, took a deep breath, and smiled in that way. Only he could. It was a smile that said, "I see something you haven't yet seen." And indeed he did. Where others saw a military suicide, Alexander saw an opening, the kind of opening only a genius or a lunatic would bet on. He threw everything into speed and the shock of surprise. While the Persians were still trying to figure out whether it was real or just a collective delusion, Alexander's troops were already in the water. The current pushed, the mud made it slippery, arrows cut through the sky. But the Macedonians pressed on, and in the midst of it all, there he was, Alexander, leading as if he were the first to ever step on the battlefield and the last to retreat. A true lightning bolt cutting through the Granicus. The attack was direct, savage, and theatrical. It was as if Alexander was saying, "I came here to fight, and no amount of water or well-trained horses is going to stop me." The Persians, watching the scene unfold in real time, weren't ready for such audacity. Because, let's be honest, who attacks by charging up a river with the enemy waiting? Only someone who doesn't see defeat as an option, and that crazy crossing was only the beginning. What came next would make Granicus truly tremble, because now that Alexander the Great's army had infiltrated enemy territory, there was no turning back. And with the river crossed, the next step would be as brutal as it needed to be. Then came the moment when Alexander himself decided to lead the elite cavalry, the companions. He wasn't the type of leader who commanded from afar. He rode in the front, eyes blazing and spear pointed toward the impossible. It was as if he said, "Follow me, or stand aside and watch a man make history on his own." The Persian Empire was still trying to reorganize after the crossing, but Alexander the Great was coming like a thunderbolt. And no one can hold back a thunderbolt. The impact was so violent that the ground shook. Alexander rode with surgical fury, aiming straight at the Persian nobles, the leaders, the pillars of command. It wasn't just a charge, it was a symbolic beheading. He wanted to cut the head off resistance before it could even comprehend what was happening. And amid the chaos, there was a tense moment. Alexander almost got killed in close combat. It was there, in the heat of the battle, that a Persian noble raised his sword against him. Everything was set for tragedy. But Clytus, the Black, swooped in and saved Alexander at the last second. A precise cut, and that was it. The future of history carried on. It sends a chill down your spine to think that the course of all the West nearly changed in that blink of an eye. Alexander the Great was saved not just by an ally, but by a bond of loyalty that the Persian Empire would never understand. The Macedonian cavalry, seeing their own king in the thick of the melee, fought with twice the soul. It was impossible not to be fired up by a leader who risked his own skin for it all. And when the Persian line started to waver, it was like a house of cards collapsing in slow motion. The elite of Persia was being shattered, and the message was clear: with Alexander there was no comfort zone, only forward. But look, if you thought that only the cavalry was causing havoc, it's because you haven't seen what the foot soldiers were about to do. Because when the ground stopped vibrating from the horses' hooves, it was the Macedonian infantry's spears that began to sing. As soon as the dust settled from the cavalry charge, the real show began. The Macedonian infantry stepping into action. Those dense ranks, with spears up to 6 meters long, advanced like a living machine, precise, cold, methodical. A moving wall. They didn't shout, they didn't run. They just marched with the calm certainty of those who knew that the enemy was about to taste fear. And the Persian Empire, they felt it. It was the famed Macedonian phalanx, and let me tell you, it was almost otherworldly. Every soldier knew exactly where to be, where to aim, when to advance, and when to push. While the Persian mercenaries and soldiers were still trying to make sense of the chaos around them, the Macedonians simply swallowed them up. It was as if Alexander the Great's cavalry had opened the door, and now the infantry was coming in to clean up the room. No rush, no mercy. The Persians resisted as best they could, but they were surrounded by discipline, strategy, and pure will to win. Alexander knew that being bold wasn't enough. You had to be methodical. That's why every movement of his soldiers seemed choreographed. They weren't just warriors. They were an extension of Alexander's own mind. And against that, no amount of numbers, wealth, or cavalry could stand for long. The Persian line began to give way, then break, and soon turned into a desperate mess. The Greek mercenaries fighting for the Persian Empire tried to retreat, but they were cornered. Many were killed, others captured, but all learned one lesson: never underestimate the cool-headedness of an army marching in the name of Alexander the Great. The war at that point had changed ownership. And even after that display of force, Alexander didn't stop to celebrate. No festivals or pompous speeches, because deep down he knew that this was only the beginning. The real message still needed to be sent, and it would travel faster than any Persian army could ever catch up. When the battle ended, the field was covered with broken shields, spears stuck in the ground, and silences that spoke louder than any anthem. But Alexander didn't just see fallen bodies. He saw impact. The victory at the Granicus wasn't just a military win. It was symbolic. It was as if he had torn up the map of the Persian Empire and drawn his own. A new era was beginning, and it came with a Macedonian accent. This first victory shook Persian morale and, at the same time, lifted Greek spirits like a thunderclap on a clear day. The cities of Asia Minor, upon hearing of the feat, opened their gates with more respect than resistance. Alexander the Great didn't need to push much. His fame preceded him. And let's face it, when you win so decisively on your first go, the whole world starts paying attention. Darius III, who until then had been watching from afar, realized that this wasn't just an ordinary rebellion. It wasn't a regional uprising. It was a new, aggressive, impatient force. Alexander was coming not only with armies, but with meaning. He wanted to conquer, yes, but he also wanted to transform. And every city that fell before him did so with the weight of a symbol. The Persian Empire was no longer untouchable. The victory at Granicus also cemented Alexander's image among his own soldiers. Now they weren't fighting just for gold or territory. They were fighting for a living legend. It was like following a myth that walked, talked, and wielded a sword. And the craziest part? Alexander made it look easy, as if conquering empires was just part of his morning coffee. But even with victory in hand and the doors of enemy territory wide open, Alexander knew the road ahead was still long. The message had been sent, yes, but now it was time to answer. The real recipient, Darius III, and that confrontation, oh, that was only just beginning. The truth is, after Granicus, the world never saw Alexander the same way again. It wasn't just a victory, it was a red carpet debut. It was as if he had written in blood and glory the prologue to his own legend. And the most fascinating part, he was only just getting started. Anyone who witnessed that first chapter immediately understood the Persian Empire had just gained a problem it couldn't solve. The speed with which he acted, the way he broke the rules and redesigned strategies, all indicated that Alexander the Great wasn't just a king. He was a movement, a whirlwind crossing lands, cultures and certainties. And if in that first clash he had already brought the Persians to their knees, imagine what was coming next. The Battle of Granicus was the mold, and what came after would be the multiplication of that same genius on a continental scale. More than swords, Alexander carried an idea that boldness, vision and execution could change entire destinies. And back then, that idea was more powerful than any legion of warriors. That's why Granicus became a symbol, not just of victory, but of transformation. A new way of waging war, inspiring troops and leading empires. The Persian Empire, with all its grandeur, had just met its inverted mirror. There, Alexander etched his name among the titans of history, not by luck or magic, but by an insane combination of courage, method, and long-term vision. He didn't just want to reign. He wanted to build something that would stand the test of time. And Granicus, as the first landmark, proved that clearly. It was the kind of beginning that made any ending seem too small. But between you and me, if you thought Granicus was grand, just wait to see what happened when Alexander set his sights directly on Darius III's throne. Because that was just the dress rehearsal. The Persian Empire still had a lot to worry about. Now tell me, what would you do if you knew that the impossible was only the beginning? Alexander the Great didn't wait until he was ready. He acted. He wasn't afraid of the size of the Persian Empire. He was afraid of not leaving his mark on the world. How many times have you stayed on the sidelines, waiting for the perfect moment to cross your own Granicus? How many times have you let fear hold you back? History isn't made by those who watch, but by those who dare to lead, even if the terrain is steep, the river freezing, and the enemies look like giants. If you learned something from this battle, take it with you. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting in spite of it. So tell me in the comments, which battle are you putting off? And what's stopping you from crossing over? If this content stirred something in you, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and come with us to explore more stories that shaped the world, and that can transform yours.